Let's discuss the next topic in more detail. The president of Ukraine has arrived in Istanbul. There, he has scheduled meetings and substantive talks prepared with the president of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. According to Volodymyr Zelensky, work continues to strengthen the partnership for the real protection of people's lives, stability, and ensuring security, both in Europe and in the Middle East. Because, according to the head of the Ukrainian state, joint efforts always yield the best results. Let's discuss this topic with our guest on the air. Joining us is Maria Heliti, PhD in political science and expert in international relations. Hello.
Hello there. It's nice to see you.
Let's discuss today's visit of the head of the Ukrainian state to Turkey. So, Turkey would definitely like to once again serve as a platform for negotiations to end the Russian-Ukrainian war, to resolve important issues such as, for example, prisoner exchanges. But for now, there isn't much talk about trilateral negotiations because at this stage the representative of the American delegation is not ready to leave the United States to conduct trilateral talks. As far as we know, Russia also does not agree to travel to America for this. And what else can Turkey do to help Ukraine, considering that, in principle, Turkey still maintains contacts with both Ukraine and Russia?
I think that basically there are currently 2 points or negotiations about 2 things taking place. This is a ceasefire for Sunday. That is, on April 12th, both Ukraine and Russia will be celebrating Sunday. And it would be very good to establish a ceasefire for this period. There is also another issue. This is also, I think, the exchange of prisoners. No, Ukraine. These negotiations are ongoing, and I think that these 2 points remain, so to speak, under negotiation. Also, I think it is very important, generally speaking, to talk about Russia finally stopping its strikes on the energy infrastructure, because Ukraine has suffered a large number of these strikes, and now the energy infrastructure has been severely damaged as a result. I think this is also an issue that could perhaps be a subject of negotiations. But in addition, this will also concern Ukraine's relations with Turkey in terms of defense. And Ukraine has cooperated and continues to cooperate with Turkey in this regard. But now there is more interest not only from Turkey, but also from countries in the Middle East, in Ukrainian drones, in the Ukrainian defense system, or in countering Iranian drones. Therefore, it seems highly probable that there will be extensive and detailed discussions about a strategic and mutually beneficial partnership here, because Turkey is deeply committed and genuinely eager to play a much stronger and more influential role in the Middle East.
Yes, by the way, regarding the Middle East, I wanted to continue the conversation with you. It's interesting to observe how Ukraine's new cooperation with Middle Eastern and Persian Gulf countries is affecting its existing contacts. Our analysts often say on Freedom that Trump might be a bit jealous. But at the same time, this cooperation also opens up very good prospects for Ukraine. And it's interesting what Turkey's position is, because here it's hardly a matter of jealousy. Turkey itself is playing, let's say, in the same league. Recep Tayyip Erdogan has recently been actively building cooperation with both the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. And in principle, could Ukraine's new relationships with Middle Eastern countries be beneficial for Turkey as well? What do you think?
On the one hand, they could be beneficial. On the other hand, Ukraine is entering a field where Turkey is already very active. Therefore, I think it's important to coordinate and to discuss things with Turkey so that there isn't any additional diplomatic conflict. That is, so that there is an understanding that Ukraine is not completely taking away Turkey's bread or increasing its influence in the region, I mean the Middle East. This cooperation is happening jointly. I think that such cooperation between Ukraine and Turkey could be very beneficial for Ukraine because Turkey, it is quite possible that he may become significantly more active or will play an even more vital role regarding the ongoing Ukrainian-Russian war. This is because President Erdogan, although he has always consistently tried to take a rather balanced diplomatic position, carefully playing between the two nations, he still successfully maintains very good contacts with Russia. On the other hand, it is important to remember that he is also a key strategic partner of Ukraine. But here, it truly seems to me that the very recent and significant events that have been happening with the ongoing war in the Middle East, along with all of these various attacks on different Middle Eastern countries carried out by Iran, now we can clearly see that Turkey is starting to take a much more active and prominent position in the region. And so Erdogan had a conversation with Putin, and he also appealed for, after all, the Iranian situation should not be allowed to have any further negative impact on the escalation of wars, especially on the Russian-Ukrainian war.
Marina, it's interesting. You've revealed new nuances of Turkey's possible reaction to the cooperation between Ukraine and the countries of the Middle East. But do you see a clear distinction, for example, between the role of Ukraine and the role of Turkey? And in principle, Ukraine's experience could be useful for any country concerned about its own security, even for Turkey, just in case. Because the experience Ukraine has now is not something anyone would want to go through, of course, especially at such a cost. But at the same time, it is incredibly valuable. And today,
indeed, it is very important for this cooperation to take place because both Ukraine and Turkey produce drones. This means that it is necessary to coordinate so that these drone supplies to the Middle East region do not have a negative impact. On the partner, I am speaking from the Ukrainian side, but Ukraine has extensive experience in conducting combat operations. This is already a bit different because when manufacturing a drone is not always enough to be able to defend against a drone. That's why I think this cooperation is important. And also, of course, Turkey is closer to the Middle East. So it too could in some way become a victim of these attacks that Iran is currently carrying out. And I think that here, joint efforts, and not only manufacturing and selling drones in the Middle East, but also learning from the experience that Ukraine has, I think is very important, so that countries in the Middle East, including Turkey, can feel safer.
yes, I also want to add that the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, invited the American delegation to Kyiv to continue the trilateral negotiations. And in fact, he said that if it is not possible to resume this trilateral format, then we can actually switch to a shuttle diplomacy format. First, talk with Ukraine, then with Russia. First, as I understand it, a visit is planned to Ukraine, then to Russia. In your opinion, how feasible is this plan today? Because maintaining negotiations is very important. I think that it's important not only for Ukraine right now, but also for the United States of America. One way or another, they have their own deadline. Even if it's a political one, it's still important for Trump and his team as well.
It seems to me that the idea is probably a good one, but I'm not sure that the American side will agree to continue negotiations in Ukraine as well. I think that in all likelihood, it is quite possible that these diplomatic negotiations will continue, but they would likely occur in some neutral third country. This could once again be Turkey, or it could also potentially be the United States of America. But still, the situation right now is such that, in my opinion, there isn't really much to discuss because both sides have reached a deadlock. Neither Ukraine nor Russia is ready to make concessions. Now, this leads us to a very important question to consider. If Ukraine continues to intensify and escalate its strategic attacks on targets deep within Russia, specifically on key military targets, then I truly believe it could have a much more significant and positive impact on future negotiations, because then Russia would be far more genuinely interested in pursuing them seriously. Up to this point, an insufficient amount of significant damage has been inflicted on Russia. Consequently, the nation remains fundamentally unprepared to sit down at the negotiating table, to engage in a formal discussion or a serious debate regarding the specific objectives and outcomes it ultimately hopes to achieve. The territories in Donbas that are currently under Ukrainian control and the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant.
Maria, let's talk more about Putin's deadlines. Most experts agree that this is nothing more than a bluff, because not only Ukrainian intelligence but also British intelligence say that although the situation at the front is difficult for Ukraine, it is the best it has been in the past 10 months. This is the exact conclusion reached by British intelligence, and that Putin has absolutely no chance of capturing the Donetsk region in 2 months. And what is the condition there? Either Ukraine withdraws itself within 2 months or Russia captures the Donetsk region. And then it will move further, and the stakes will be much higher. Could the failure to meet such a deadline somehow influence Trump and, in general, his attitude toward Russia? And on the other hand, let me pose another question for you. Isn't this deadline more for Trump than for Ukraine? He basically doesn't have any time left. I mean, politically, of course.
I think so, yes. Right now, a lot of what we see in the information space is, in a way, a kind of war between Trump and Putin. It's just happening a bit differently than we would have expected. The war in Iran is also a war with Putin because it's an attack on Russia's partner. And yes, when Russia says it will capture Donbass in 2 months, most likely that's impossible because, let's say, for a very long time, Russia hasn't been able to make significant advances in this part of the Donetsk region. This means that this bluff, which is really being thrown at Trump, but for Trump, I think the whole story with Ukraine is now, in a way, overshadowed by Iran. And Iran, it's as important for Trump and for other countries as it is for Russia. And the longer the war in Iran goes on the one hand, it will affect countries, the Ukrainian situation, Europe, and the world as a whole. But still, it will also affect Russia because Russia won't be able to support Iran. And Russia will lose more and more of its partners. That is the trust of its partners that it currently has because, as we can see from the Syrian story, Russia cannot be trusted because it does not help even those countries with which it has agreements. It has an agreement with Iran on joint defense efforts. And now what we are seeing, I think that in principle, no deadline will be met, no deadline will be achieved. And it seems to me that, and these ongoing conflicts, they will simply continue to persist until both of the sides are truly able, and here I am referring specifically to both Iran and Ukraine, until these sides are finally able to deliver sufficiently devastating and crushing blows to the heart of the enemy, so that the opposing enemy eventually becomes much more willing to negotiate. I'm talking about Iran and Russia. So for Ukraine, what remains for us to do is to continue attacking those targets that in some way affect Russia's defense. And I think the moment will come when Russia itself will want to negotiate in order to end this war. We
have literally a little time left, about a minute. It's interesting how much the situation could change. Ukraine's cooperation with Middle Eastern countries, in one way or another, adds a certain level of authority to Ukraine on the international stage. And also the confirmation from British intelligence, not just Ukrainian, that things are not going so well for Russia. Things are not going well for them at the front. How much could this change the position of American partners as well, including the idea that pressure should not be put on Ukraine?
This has a significant impact because such partnerships with Middle Eastern countries may provide Ukraine with funding. Because even if they buy some weapons from Ukraine, firstly, Ukraine will receive additional finances, which it needs in order to produce more weapons for itself. On the other hand, this will change Ukraine's overall position, its role, and its weight in the world. This means that Ukraine is interesting to the world and more interesting to Trump. If Ukraine is not interesting, obviously, it will have fewer opportunities to receive additional support. That's why I think there will be a shift in Trump's attitude or position with less pressure on Ukraine. And instead, he will focus more on Russia